Hello, thank you all for tuning in today. My name is Katie Peace. I'm the Director of Communications for the Preservation League of New York State. If you have found your way to this webinar and are not familiar with who the League is, we are New York's statewide nonprofit focused on investing in people and projects that champion the essential role of preservation in community revitalization, sustainable economic growth, and the protection of our historic buildings and landscapes. Because we're a nonprofit, we rely on our members to make the work we do possible. So people like you, thank you. Thank you for your support and for tuning in. And I also want to give a shout out to our program sponsor, the Peggy Ann and Roger G. Gary Charitable Trust. They have been sponsoring our Preservation Book Club and our Future of Preservation webinar. So thank you to the Gary Trust. The League does our work all over the state in lots of different ways. We have technical services, grant programs, our 7 to Save list of endangered historic sites, our Excellence in Historic Preservation Awards, public policy and advocacy that we do at the local, state, and federal levels, and online programming. So lots of great webinars, author talks, historic tax credit workshops, things like that. And you can find a whole archive of our programming on our YouTube channel, which I will drop in the chat later. But today we are going to be talking about the Adirondack Park Agency. So we're really excited about today's author talk with Brad Edmondson. And this is actually the first event this month that's going to be shining a light on the Adirondacks. So we have this event today. Next Wednesday, we have a webinar all about preservation in the Adirondacks from a personal, community-based, and regional perspective. So tune into that on Wednesday from 12 to 1:30. And then later in the month, we'll be doing some video tours of various places in the Adirondacks that the League has had a hand in over the years. So that should be fun. Make sure that you follow us on Facebook and Instagram for all of that great content. But today's author talk is really going to be focused on the Adirondack Park Agency, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary in 2021. And Brad Edmondson wrote this book, A Wild Idea, How the Environmental Movement Tamed the Adirondacks. And this has been a total labor of love for Brad. He spent years doing dozens and dozens of interviews to make this book happen. So we're really excited to be hearing from Brad today. He's a writer and consultant who has written several books, including Ice Cream Social, The Struggle for the Soul of Ben & Jerry's, and Post-War Cornell. He's going to be joining us in just a second, but I do want to give a couple housekeeping notes. So this is being recorded. It will be up on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page, so you can find it later if you need to. And if you have questions during Brad's presentation, please do drop them in the Q&A box. After Brad's presentation, we'll be sharing a video clip of a trailer for a documentary that is kind of a companion piece to the book. And then Brad will be joined in conversation by Erin Tobin, the League's Vice President for Policy and Preservation. So if you have questions, drop them in the Q&A box. Erin will get to as many of those questions as possible during their conversation. If you have general comments, you can drop them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat and I'll be dropping links there as necessary. But until then, I will hand it over to Brad. Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, Katie. I'm going to be talking with slides for a little bit. So let me first get my screen up in front of you and open this document. So yeah, this is the book. It came out in May, just sold out of its first printing, and it's going into a second printing, which is pretty good for a book about land use planning in the 70s. But it's actually a pretty dramatic story, which I'll get into in a little bit. When I started working on this 18 years ago, I really didn't know how big the Adirondack Park was, and maybe some of you don't either. It's roughly the same size as the state of Vermont, as you can see on this map. It's a big, big chunk of land, and most of it is privately owned. And so what this book is commemorating is are 2 plans that were drafted 50 years ago and written into law in 1972 and 73. The first one was for privately owned land in the park, and the other one was for the state-owned forest preserve. And these 2 plans were really as important to the Adirondack Park as the creation of the park in 1892 and the adoption of the Forever Wild Clause in 1894. So in the next half hour or so, I'm going to explain why the APA laws were so important and how they came to pass. Now, as I said, land use planning is ordinarily considered a pretty boring topic, but this one is dramatic for a couple of reasons. One is that the plan was a really wild idea at the time. It had never been tried. It was basically a proof of concept run for environmental impact statements, which were untested in 1971. And nobody had ever really tried that on such a vast scale. And the second reason why there's a lot of drama in this story is that this was a huge imposition of state power on a rural area, and the locals didn't like it one bit. They felt like they weren't being listened to, so they reacted in the only way they could, with protests that eventually became violent. Now, one more thing before we get into the story. The big idea that's sort of behind the wild idea is the Forever Wild Clause. And even if you have heard of the Forever Wild Clause, you may not know how unusual it is. It's an article in the New York State Constitution that makes it illegal to cut down a single tree on state-owned land in the Adirondacks without passing a statewide referendum that takes 2 years to set up. It's an extreme level of land protection. And from the very beginning in 1894, defenders of it have been willing to step forward and challenge any deviation from that very strict standard in court. So even the smallest proposed changes to the Adirondack Forest Reserve have been struck down because the Forever Wild Clause uses very specific language. The thing about the APA is that before the agency came along, the vision behind the Forever Wild Clause wasn't protected. And so you might say that 50 years ago, the Adirondacks truly became a park. So the first person I interviewed 18 years ago was this guy, Clarence Petty, was shown here in 1973 at the age of 68. Clarence died in 2009 at the age of 104, and he remained active and alert until the very end. He was a great place to start because his career is a through line of 20th century Adirondack history. He was born in 1905. He spent his first years in a log cabin on state land in Upper Saranac Lake. He moved to a legal home 2 miles away. And you might have heard or been told by your parents that they walked to school in the snow. You have it easy. I used to walk to school in the snow. Clarence and his brother Bill really did that. And it was 18 miles one way to school in the snow from their house in the forest preserve. They walked to Saranac Lake on Sunday and they walked home on Friday, often while wearing snowshoes. Clarence was a state forest ranger, but in his heart, he was an Adirondack kid who loved to explore the backcountry. And in 1959, he got a dream assignment when a legislative committee in New York wanted to know how much state land in the Adirondacks would meet a legal definition of the term wilderness. They hired Clarence and a partner to find out, and those two men spent 3 years flying and walking over every acre of the Adirondack Forest Reserve. They found that 1 million acres would qualify if the state removed just a few roads and cabins, 1 million acres of wilderness. So I interviewed about 6 dozen people for this story, and again I was struck by how much of the story turns on personal relationships. Clarence and his partner, that's the guy in the middle, Neil Stout, they reported their findings to the guy who's holding out his plate, Watson Pomeroy. Pomeroy was a state assemblyman who was chair of the state legislative committee that sent the two men out to survey the forest preserve. In the early 1960s, when this was taking place, citizens groups were getting pressure. They were putting pressure on legislators to do something. And they were just a couple of groups, really. There was the Adirondack Mountain Club for hikers. There was the Conservation Council, which represented hunters. And then there were small fringe groups of bird watchers and romantics who thought that wild nature should be protected for its own sake. And Clarence Petty belonged to this group. He turned Assemblyman Pomeroy into a forever wilder by taking him on camping trips like the one pictured here. And their relationship took the Forever Wild Clause sort of out of the fringe of New York state politics and moved it a little closer into the mainstream. Another relationship which is central to the story is the relationship between the governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, who's on the right, and his best friend, who's his younger brother, Lawrence, who's the guy in the middle. They're shown here on an overnight horseback riding trip to the high peaks in 1965. The guy on the left is Clarence's older brother, Bill, who also was a state forest ranger. And Bill was the other guy who walked 18 miles to school one way wearing snowshoes. So Nelson Rockefeller was probably the most powerful governor in New York's history. He was a leader of a very small group of white men who had enormous power and whose power was rarely challenged. And people used to call this group the establishment. Lawrence Rockefeller was definitely a member of the establishment too. He was not an elected official. He was a businessman turned philanthropist whose passion was making big parks for the public to enjoy. Rockefeller money played a direct role in creating at least 6 national parks, and Lawrence, more than anyone else, pushed the federal government into the business of buying and protecting open space. So Lawrence had a private think tank, as you would if you were a Rockefeller brother. And in the summer of 1967, without really talking to anybody first, he released a proposal to turn the high peaks and central Adirondacks into a national park. This is a map of Lawrence Rockefeller's proposal. It's sort of a boundary within a boundary. The larger boundary, the blue one, is the boundary of the existing Adirondack Park, the blue line. And the green line in the middle of the picture are the lands that Lawrence Rockefeller proposed turning into a national park. Now, consensus is a very hard thing to get to in New York politics, but it did happen in this case. Everyone hated this idea for a whole bunch of different reasons. 2/3 of the existing park was untouched, and the state didn't know what to do with that. No hunting is involved in national parks. Rockefeller proposed buying 600,000 acres of private land through eminent domain if necessary. But more than that, even people who weren't personally affected felt like this is New York's park, and we're doing a fine job. We can do a better job than the feds. And the Forever Wild Clause is important to us. So the governor knew immediately that the national park proposal was toxic, but he loved his brother. And he also noticed that a lot of people agreed with Lawrence that something needed to be done. So in 1967, when this proposal was made, the Adirondack Park had problems. There were a lot of illegal roads into the Forever Wild Forest Preserve. There were a lot of illegal camps. Even the legal campsites were overcrowded. There were overflowing trash cans. And then the big thing was that developers were buying up huge chunks of rural land in other parts of the United States and were carving them up into home lots and selling them for vacation homes, often with absolutely no zoning or planning in these huge vacation home developments. People were really afraid that this was going to happen to the Adirondacks. So Governor Rockefeller did what a lot of politicians do in this situation. He appointed a commission to study the problem, and that's often a way to sidestep a controversy, but that really wasn't where Nelson Rockefeller was coming from. He always described himself as a problem solver. He liked to get smart people together and have them come up with big, bold ideas. So he recruited 11 members of the establishment and hired 15 very talented young staff members and formed the Temporary Study Commission on the Future of the Adirondacks, which is pictured in this photograph. The commissioners and the staff handing the report over to the governor. Rockefeller asked them to recommend how to solve the park's problems. So another trigger for this commission was that an interstate highway had just opened up that ran up the east side of the Adirondack Park from Albany to Montreal, the Northway. This is the Northway in the first year of its existence. You can see those charming late model American sedans there. And so Lawrence Rockefeller wanted to recreate the Adirondacks in this modern spirit because national parks in the 1960s were about getting people to recreation centers in their cars. They were about building parkways, building campgrounds, hotels, beaches with lifeguards, snack bars, getting the maximum number of people to the recreational resource. The Forever Wild Clause was sort of in the way of this idea, and Lawrence Rockefeller wanted to get rid of it. He proposed transferring the land to the federal government because it would mean getting rid of the Forever Wild Clause. And several other members of the Temporary Study Commission agreed with this view that the Forever Wild Clause was sort of in the way. But the governor also put several strong defenders of the Forever Wild Clause onto the commission. And the most important of these was the staff director, Harold Gerry. Gerry was just an employee. He was not a voting member of the commission, but he was as hardcore a Forever Wilder as it gets. He wanted no buildings at all to be allowed in the large stands of timber that claimed most of the park's private land. He wanted the Forever Wild Clause strictly enforced, and he made sure that the people he hired agreed with him. So another key relationship here, the first person Harold Gerry hired was Clarence Petty, because Clarence knew the forest preserve better than anyone else. But the key relationship I want to talk about is the second hire, who was the guy on the right, a 28-year-old ex-US forest ranger who had just enrolled in graduate school at Cornell. George Davis wanted to study how to preserve natural ecosystems in the Adirondacks while also allowing people to work and play there. He wanted to apply a new concept called carrying capacity. The idea was to use data on soils, slopes, wildlife, wetlands, and other factors to rate the ability of a given place to handle development without degrading the area around it. And that was an exact match for the job that Harold Gerry needed to fill. So Harold Gerry hired George Davis, and he became his mentor. He paired him with Clarence Petty, and he said to Davis and Petty, "Get out of the office and don't come back." So George and Clarence spent the next year hiking all over the forest preserve. They were two of about 12 staff members who did an amazing amount of research in 14 months. They turned in 800 pages of reports on land, wildlife, transportation, the economy, and other subjects. If you can get a copy of these technical reports, they still make for really good reading. So all of this research went to the commissioners, who had to make recommendations. But first, the two factions that I mentioned, the Forever Wilders and the people who favored an Adirondack National Park, they had to have a private battle. And after a year, the Forever Wilders won the battle. They elected a new chairman who did a masterful job of turning a very bold set of recommendations into law. Now, here's another relationship. The man on the left is Governor Nelson Rockefeller. He's got his arm around Harold Hookshield, who was a wealthy retired mining executive who loved the Adirondacks so much that he founded and endowed the Adirondack Experience Museum on Blue Mountain Lake. Needless to say, Harold Hookshield also thought that the Forever Wild Clause was sacred. The man on the right was Hookshield's secret weapon, John Oakes. He was the editorial page editor of the New York Times, and he was another true blue defender of Adirondack wilderness. Hookshield knew that the Times would endorse recommendations to ensure that the Adirondacks remained a 6 million acre wilderness park. And the commission released those recommendations at the beginning of 1971. Their timing was absolutely perfect. So if you're in your mid-60s or older, you might remember the first Earth Day in 1970. You'll remember a sense of anxiety and urgency that swept over the country. A majority of Americans suddenly believed that the planet was in danger of being suffocated by pollution and overcrowding. And New York City was the epicenter of this feeling. If you needed city voters to get reelected in 1970, as Nelson Rockefeller did, you needed to have strong pro-environment positions. And you also needed the endorsement of the New York Times. So the commission's recommendations were released on January 3rd, 1971. And if you have a background in newspapers, the kind that were printed on paper, you know that the left side of the page above the fold on Sunday is the most important and powerful spot in journalism. And this was the most important and powerful newspaper in New York, probably in the country. This is a story that you can see the headline, "New Policy Urged for the Adirondacks," and a picture of a person sitting next to an Adirondack lake there. So the New York Times positioned this story right at the top. And Hookshield used his relationship with the Times as both a carrot and a stick. He threatened politicians who might not vote with him with condemnation in the Times, and he rewarded other politicians who agreed with him, like Governor Nelson Rockefeller, as long as Rockefeller backed him up. So the Temporary Study Commission released 181 extremely ambitious recommendations. They were ranked. So recommendation number 1 was the most important one, and it called for a new state agency that would write these 2 big master plans. And this was indeed a wild idea. And one reason for that was that land use decisions in New York are usually left to local governments. In fact, they're left to local governments almost everywhere. There's another clause in the New York State Constitution that's known as home rule, which means that certain powers are reserved for localities and townships. And it's a big deal to ignore home rule, but they were essentially saying to the local towns in the Adirondacks, you can't handle these challenges, the state is going to take over. The second reason it was wild was the scope. We're talking about 6 million acres here, territory the size of Vermont. The plan for the public lands was going to cover as much territory as Yellowstone National Park. And the plan for the private lands was going to cover as much acreage as the state of Connecticut. And Rockefeller really wanted the Adirondack Park Agency to pass. He was very lucky, too. He introduced the bill in April 1971, just before the second Earth Day. And this commercial dropped on Earth Day 1971. You might remember it, or you might have heard of it. What? Some people don't. Right for Pollution Booklet, Box 1771, Radio City Station, New York. Now that actor there, the Indian actor, is actually Sicilian. His name is Oscar Corti, but he had a long career in Hollywood playing Native Americans under the stage name Iron Eyes Cody. And that PSA was the most effective public service announcement ever aired on television. People went absolutely nuts for that ad. I was 11 years old when the ad came out. My older brother was 13, and our Boy Scout troop immediately started picking up litter from roadsides. And I still remember how angry we were at litter bugs. And at the same time, the environmental movement by the early 70s had become quite sophisticated. It knew how to harness this public passion and exert pressure on politicians. And so the Adirondack Park Agency Act passed 50 years ago in June. And this is how, this is how 28-year-old George Davis found himself alone in a log building in Raybrook that the DEC had recently abandoned and had planned to burn down. George Davis was the first employee of the Adirondack Park Agency, and for several weeks, he was the entire APA staff. He tells this story, he's very fond of this story about his first day on the job, where he got the key from the new, the DEC building had just been built next door. So he got the key from the DEC guy, and he went into this log cabin that's in this photo. It was absolutely empty. There was no furniture, there were no people, there was nothing. And, but he had a strong feeling that he needed to get started because he had an enormous amount to do. So he went back next door again, and he found out that you could use something called a purchase order to buy stuff in town. So he got a purchase order and he went into town and he bought 2 big cartons of toilet paper. And he brought them back, and the first carton was his desk, And the second curtain was his chair. And he said it was like that for several weeks before he was finally able to sort of beg furniture from people around the offices in Raybrook. So it was a pretty informal operation. This was what the staff of the Adirondack Park Agency looked like in 1972. Davis is the guy on the extreme left wearing the blazer. The APA reported to 9 board members, but there was not very much supervision for that first year. They had the closest contact with 2 board members who were both alumni of the Temporary Study Commission, the chairman of the board, Richard Lawrence, and Peter Payne, who was a young attorney from Willsboro who worked tirelessly on this topic for actually ended up working on it for 30 years. But the Raybrook offices were very isolated. They were 165 miles away from Albany. And there was a budget crisis going on in Albany. So the budget was just ridiculously small. George Davis wasn't able to hire a full staff until about 4 months before the plan was due. They had an insane amount of work to do on a very short deadline with very tight funds. So it was kind of more like a tech startup or the 1971 version of a tech startup than anything else. There was a refrigerator in the back of the log cabin that George Davis kept stocked with beer, beer that the state of New York paid for. There were rules about how you could have a beer. You couldn't like come in the morning and immediately start drinking beer. But if you came back from doing some field work, you could take a break and have a beer. If you're having a cigarette break, you could have a beer. If you're working evenings and weekends, you could have a beer at your desk. They were much more focused on performance than they were on rules. So it was a state agency. And you think about what it's like to work at a state agency today, it was really pretty different. They had an immense amount of work to do, though, so they couldn't really get drunk during the day. All of their data had to be field checked. So they spent an enormous amount of time driving around in ratty old state cars that other agencies had thrown away, which is a whole other set of stories. And it became pretty clear to them that they weren't going to be able to make it really by the deadline, the end of 1972, to submit their plan to the 1973 legislature. So they Richard Lawrence asked Governor Rockefeller for an extension. He said, can't we please have another year so we can do a really good job on this report? And Rockefeller said, no, you submit the plan for the 1973 legislature or pack up and go home. So then things got really crazy. And George Davis tells another story about October 23rd, 1972, the day before the maps that delineated all of the different land use categories finally had to be turned over to the commissioners. He and a colleague got up at 4 in the morning in Raybrook, drove 2 hours to southern Hamilton County, spent the whole day driving around field checking the data on the maps, made about 15 changes, quit when it got too dark to see, called the office and said, we've got changes, we need the maps revised, we'll be home in 2 hours. Got to Raybrook around 11 o'clock at night. And Davis says everyone on the staff was there. They all had their pencils sharpened, their base maps ready, and they were ready to get to work. And and he also said the janitor was even there because he felt left out, and the janitor went and got the beer. Davis talked a lot about beer. So they finally did their revisions, packed them in a car and drove 90 miles to a meeting in Lake George, where the commissioners got their first look at the map about 6 weeks before they had to turn it on to the public. It was an amazing effort, an enormous amount of work, taking a new concept and grafting it onto an enormous area, but it was done in a big hurry. And there were lots of holes in it. There were lots of weak points. It almost didn't matter, though, because the staff had a secret weapon, which was the environmental movement. My wife, Tanya, who many of you know, Tanya Werbitsky, she made me put this in here. I don't know if any of you can identify the guy on the right, but he was a very important figure in the early years of the APA. That is Bob Kaifen. who was on the board of the Preservation League for many years. But this is Bob Kaifen in the early 1970s, the mid 1970s, with his legal partner, Ed Needleman. They were practicing law in Glens Falls, and they were hired by the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund to basically bird dog the APA and the DEC and keep up with what was going on and what was likely to happen and what the thinking of the commissioners were. And they did a fabulous job. And they sent out these newsletters all across the state to environmental leaders so that everyone in the environmental movement knew exactly what was happening, when to write letters, and what to say. And so Kaifen played a really important role in the formation of the APA, although he likes to keep quiet, likes to keep under his leather hat there. I think that's a really cute picture. So the plan that they initially released, I don't have time to go into the details of it, but there were 6 different categories of land use. There were also complicated regulations about the use of land around the shores of lakes. It was a very complicated plan. And the essence of it is that the bright green land is called resource management. And on that land, you can put 1 structure on every 43 acres. The aqua colored greenish land is the state forest preserve, where absolutely no building is ever allowed. And the yellow land is called rural use, where you can put 1 building on every 8.5 acres. Now, resource management and rural use, when you take them together, that was 85% of the private land in the park. So it was a very strict plan that channeled development toward the existing townships and villages. And they released this plan to the public for comment 3 days before Christmas in 1972, really without telling anybody in advance what they were going to do. And it was kind of like throwing a lit match into a puddle of gasoline. This is a photograph that was taken at a public hearing in Saranac Lake in January 1973. The chairman, Richard Lawrence, is shown at the podium on the right. And that's the Saranac Lake High School auditorium. It's packed to the rafters with 800 people. There are state policemen lining the back of the hall. And according to Lawrence, those policemen were really pretty terrified that it was going to be a riot because the crowd was very unruly and very angry. But Lawrence didn't have time really to listen to the locals because he had to get this law passed. And he also knew that it wasn't essential to get their hearts and minds because all of the people that Dick Lawrence needed to convince were in Albany. The concerns of the 100,000 people who lived in the park were basically ignored, and the locals did not forget that. So the private land plan was signed into law in May 1973, and I want to just make 3 points in conclusion. First is the APA probably could not happen today in the way it happened then for a lot of reasons, but mostly because the public doesn't trust elected officials now as much as they did then. The amazing thing is that this private land plan, the 6 million acre regional land use plan, is still the law, and it's still basically unchanged. And this is because the APA is entirely a creature of the governor. He appoints the board and controls the staff. It doesn't have anything to do with the legislature. And every governor since Rockefeller has been kept in line by a big, well-organized citizens movement that defends the forever wild Adirondacks. The second point is that the APA really weakened themselves by not paying attention to the locals. The opposition to the APA in the North Country became entrenched. And so the state agency spent a whole lot of its time fighting instead of building partnerships. I talked with Jim Hotelling, who was a planner who was brought in 1977 to sort of mend fences. And he started his job at the APA by asking people in the towns and villages what they wanted for the future of their communities. He said he wanted to find out what their hopes and dreams were so that he would have something to build on when he brought in the APA's idea. And Hotelling basically told me that the original plan that he got to work on in 1977, George Davis's plans, he said, were all brains and no heart. And so my final point here is that the original wild idea, which is preserving the natural integrity of an entire bioregion, is really a whole lot more important now than it was in 1971. Because in a way, the entire planet is now where the Adirondacks were in 1967 because of the immense challenge of climate change. And the challenges now in the Adirondacks are far beyond the ability of the APA or even the state to fix. Responding effectively to climate change means doing landscape level conservation on a global scale. Now, fortunately, there's a lot of support for landscape level conservation. Florida, for example, is not exactly a blue state, but last month, Florida committed to spending $400 million this year to acquire open space. They have 3 goals. They want to create wildlife corridors to protect biodiversity. They want to ensure a supply of clean water for the people of Florida, and they want to give Floridians places to be in nature. These are precisely the reasons the Adirondack Park was set up 129 years ago. So was the APA a one-off? Yes and no. It could not happen again in the same way. Certainly could have been done better, but it was still an amazing accomplishment. And one day we might even look back on it as the beginning of a new era. Climate change gives us a compelling reason to act to protect entire bioregions, but we're not going to succeed if our efforts are all brains and no heart. So that's the end of my spiel. And now I'm going to stop sharing and ask Katie to show you a preview of a documentary that's going to be made and shown in October up in the North Country, hopefully in Albany too. Katie, it's all yours.
New York's Adirondack Park is bigger than Yellowstone, Yosemite, Glacier, Grand Canyon, and Great Smokies National Parks combined. It is one of the largest unbroken deciduous forests on Earth. It has 1,000 miles of wild and scenic rivers and hundreds of crystal clear lakes and lofty peaks. But here is an even more amazing thing about the Adirondack Park. Most of its land is privately owned, and 85 million people live within a day's drive. Yet the Adirondacks seem almost completely undeveloped. How did that happen?
In the story of land use planning in the United States, the Adirondack Park Agency is truly significant. For what it was doing at that time, it was on the frontier of land use planning.
The Adirondack Park Agency was a wild idea when it was created 50 years ago. It owes its existence to several big trends that combined to create an irresistible force. After World War II, a small group of activists spent more than 2 decades building the case that the Adirondacks needed to be protected from development. By 1968, they had overwhelming public support. The activists pressured Governor Nelson Rockefeller to act. Rocky set up a commission that studied the Adirondacks for 2 years before issuing 181 recommendations that were, in a word, bold. Many of them had never been tried before, and despite the risks, Rockefeller eagerly supported the activists' cause.
You know, he believed in big things. He was not a small man in any sense of the word. It wouldn't have happened without him. There's no question about it.
Rockefeller strong-armed state lawmakers into passing the bill that created the Adirondack Park Agency, or APA. He ordered the agency to write 2 master plans for all the land in the park, a territory the size of the state of Vermont, and to deliver them in less than 2 years. Nothing like that had ever been done before. The APA's young staff was brilliant, passionate about protecting the park, and extremely hardworking. The plans they produced were revolutionary, but they lacked 2 critical things: money and time.
We were given a very, very tight deadline and a very low budget. I mean, the budget was just ridiculous.
The APA also did not try very hard to explain its tough new regulations to local landowners, even though zoning laws had been almost entirely unknown in the Adirondacks. The activists were so focused on saving land, they didn't think about the 100,000 people who lived in the park. And many of those people were outraged.
I don't think it ever occurred to me or anyone that I was working with that maybe the local people might have a very different attitude about this plan to create a state agency. It just didn't occur to us at the time. Just didn't occur.
Over its first 50 years, the Adirondack Park Agency has been praised and studied as a triumph of land use planning. Today, the urgent need to control climate change depends on preserving and restoring large forests. New York did that in a big way 50 years ago. The wide open spaces of the Adirondacks are now recognized as a global treasure.
This is a big, wild area in a highly populated state where we have found a way to reasonably balance the protection of nature and the rights of people to live there. And I think the lessons from the Adirondacks are actually globally important.
But a lot of people who live inside the park disagree with this view. Even after 50 years, they still think the agency and its restrictions on private land development are un-American. They say private property is private, and the Adirondacks don't need more wilderness as much as it needs better jobs.
The agency has convinced people by repeating this untruth over and over again that this is the largest park in the United States. And they call all of the land inside of this Blue Land Park, which is not true. 60% of that land is privately owned. No privately owned land is part of a state park. In other words, they have taken the theory that Hitler practiced. If you tell a lie often enough, it will soon become believed, and it will be a fact.
It's an endless debate that boils down to a basic question. What is wild land worth?
Go back wherever you come from, but get out of here.
And next time they're going to see him with deer rifles, then they better have another thought about this, because we are deadly serious about defending our rights up here.
Okay. So
All
what'd you
right.
think?
It's very dramatic.
Sharon?
I thought that's a great trailer that encapsulates so much of the issues that came up during the creation of the APA. And I just want to say hello. And it's thank you to everyone for joining this conversation. And I have a couple questions. And anyone who's participating who would like to ask a question, drop it in the Q&A. I don't think we have any questions just yet there, but please feel free to ask a question and I'll pose it. We can answer it. I have a couple questions of my own to start with. And one of my first questions was around the remarkable archive that your book documents and the level of, the amount of primary documents and quotes and oral histories that you were able to gain access to is quite incredible. But it did make me think, what were some documents, materials that you knew were out there that you couldn't get access to, that whether because you don't know if they exist anymore or you just couldn't get your hands on them? Was there anything that you, any kind of hidden treasure that you still haven't been able to get to?
Yes, several actually. There was this thing that happened a year ago last March. I don't know if you were aware of it, where a lot of stuff closed really suddenly and stayed closed for a long time. And one of the things that closed and really took its time reopening was the New York State Archives. And there's a lot of treasures in the New York State Archives related to the Adirondacks and the APA. They're not particularly easy to find because the archives is so big, and you really have to develop a feel for their filing system. And you also, the rule of archival research is no matter what's up on the internet, no matter what the finding aid is like that you can download virtually, you have to go there because the finding aids are imperfect, and there's always treasure hidden if you go there. So the closure of different archives, notably the state archives, made it difficult to extend the scope of this book past the signing of the law in 1973. And the interviews that I did before I wrote the book covered a whole lot of ground after the APA was set up. And there's a lot of information in the interviews and the videotaped interviews, as you saw, from the opponents of the APA explaining the opposition. And so, so when the pandemic closed everything, I had researched up to the point where I could comfortably bring the reader up to the signing of the law, but not to the opposition and the early years of the APA. So I decided to stop the book with the signing and go on. And now with the incredible support of my research partner, Tanya Orbitsky, who's very easily bribed, by the way, with hikes. If you can take her on a hike, she'll go work with you. So anyway, we're working on volume 2 now. That's going to take the reader closer into the present. But I should also say the reason why the book was possible really was the incredible archive at the Adirondack Museum in Blue Mountain Lake, which did reopen fairly quickly, and where a very large proportion of the primary material was there. And that's where the transcripts of the oral history interviews I did will end up.
Oh, great. That's wonderful. That will be in itself a treasure for somebody down the road, writing a version, chapters 4, 5, and 6, perhaps. So I have a couple questions, but I have a follow-up to that. But one of the other questions I had, I had a couple favorite stories from the book that made me chuckle, and you might have already shared your favorite story in your presentation. But I was wondering if you have a favorite story that you uncovered in your research for the book, and if so, what was it?
Oh, one of the things that kept me engaged in this project for such a long time was that the people I interviewed were such remarkably good storytellers. And there were so many good ones. One of the anecdotes that I think really contains a lot of insight into the way things were back then came from George Davis. George, I said in the talk, I said that second home developments were a threat, considered a threat, large vacation home developments on the privately owned land in the park. Well, one of the people who was developing one of the very largest ones, a guy named Louis Paparazzo, he wanted to build 4,000 to 7,000 home sites just north of Tupper Lake. And Paparazzo said, I'm an environmentally responsible developer. This is 1970, 71. I'm going to do this right. I'm going to make an environmental impact statement about this project, even though I'm not required to, just because I'm a good guy. And so he asked around and he said, who could write me an environmental impact statement? So he called George Davis, and George Davis was a graduate student at Cornell at this time. And he was also married with 3 little kids, and he had a grad student salary. And so he really needed side work. He didn't want the development built at all, but he took the job. And he walked around Paparazzo's land, and he basically used the job as a test run for the system that he eventually did for the Adirondack Park Agency that created this map that's behind me, this incredibly complex map that governs land use in the park. And Paparazzo paid him to do it. And then when this plan was put into effect, it basically made it impossible for Paparazzo to build his development. So I thought that was kind of a cool story.
There's
Paparazzo was very angry.
Yes, he was. There's a lot of good George Davis stories. One of my favorites was about buying beer after the 11-hour day, and I think it was Clarence Petty who was like, "No, you can't," and he's like, "Yes, I can."
Yeah, Clarence was a real Boy Scout. I mean, Clarence was just as straight and narrow as they come, and George was not. George Davis was not. And George really liked beer a lot. So the punchline of that story is that they went into a bar in somewhere way out there, like Big Moose or Stillwater or something like that. They went into a bar after a day of mucking around in a swamp, and it was hot and buggy in the middle of the afternoon. And George says, "I'm going to go into this bar and have a beer." And Clarence says, "No, you're not. You're wearing a state uniform and it's during the day. You can't do that. You're driving a state car." And George says, "Watch me." So Clarence went to it was like 85 degrees or something. Clarence went to the trunk of the car and got out a yellow DEC rain jacket and put it over his ranger uniform and walked into the bar wearing his jacket and sat next to George while George drank his beer, and Clarence ordered water. But they were really good friends. They each man said that he was very fond of the other.
Yeah, the story of their friendship was really fun to see evolve. That was a nice through narrative in the book. Let's see. Well, so a couple of my questions have to do with, and I still, anybody who has questions, feel free to ask, but I could keep going. So a couple of my questions have to do with kind of the impact of the TSC and the creation of the APA on the future. And because, given the amount of research you've done and your familiarity with the topics, I'm wondering, this is like a multi-part question, but have you, there were very clear sides and camps through the discussions, through the Temporary Study Commission and into the creation of the APA and getting the bill passed. But would you say that the Forever Wild ethos has evolved since then? And to what extent? And then if not, do you see a future where it may?
That's a great question, Erin. That's a really good question. And the answer is yes, it has evolved. But there are still a lot of people in the environmental community who think that it's a bad idea and that it should not evolve. And so this is basically the same group of people who since 1894 have taken any proposal that would deviate from the Forever Wild Clause and challenged it in court, and often have gotten it shot down because the language of the Forever Wild Clause is so specific. The group that's ordinarily identified with this really hardline view is called Protect the Adirondacks. And Protect the Adirondacks is an outgrowth. Really, it's formed by a merger and combination of a group that was formed in 1901 called the Association for the Protection of the Adirondacks, which was a group of camp owners who had enough money to hire the best lawyers in the state to defend the forever wild clause. So it's really been an unbroken chain for 129 years now. What has happened, the reason why I say yes, it has evolved, is that the environmental movement has evolved, and the field of land use and open space protection has evolved quite a bit in the last 40 years. And that's sort of what volume 2 of the book is about. And I'd say that probably the Adirondack Council, which is a much larger organization and somewhat more moderate than Protect in its positions, it represents the evolution of the environmental movement. It's much more mainstream, much more wired into Albany politics, and willing to compromise in order to get closer to its goals. It's also, I think, a lot of environmental organizations give lip service to the idea that economic development inside the Adirondack Park is an important environmental goal, the proper forms of economic development, basically ensuring decent lives for the people who hold the jobs that support the tourist economy in the park. And I think the Adirondack Council takes that position pretty seriously.
Great, great. I liked the bit about Santanoni in the book, and I suspect that great camp will feature more heavily in volume 2.
Yeah, actually, you and many other people on the call know my wife, Tanya Werbitsky. She was on the Citizens Advisory Council when they were trying to decide what to do with Santanoni. And there were several sort of friends of mine who were also on the advisory council who would taunt Tanya by just holding up a lit match when they met her, because they wanted to burn Santanoni down. These were forever wilders, and they thought, this is the forest preserve, no buildings, burn it down. And, and I think a compromise position was reached there that gives, that preserves the wilderness around Santanoni and gives the community a really important tourist draw, and also preserves an architectural treasure. So, that sort of compromise is kind of what we're looking into now.
And it's a sort of compromise, I think, as a preservation community, we'd love to see repeated more.
Yes.
For sure.
Mm-hmm. Rather than burning the buildings down, yes. Yes.
So, do you think, given the, I'm trying to, I don't know if you said it in the book or just now, but the bit about, it works when nobody's happy.
Yeah.
But that said, one of the things that really struck me, and then it was repeated in the video, was the not really necessarily thinking about the local economy or thinking about it and putting it aside, or at least the people who lived in the Adirondacks not feeling heard. And I wonder if from your interviews and research, if you feel like things might have been different, and if so, perhaps what, if there had been some other consideration, and I guess, in thinking, I'm not sure what that other consideration would have been, but some greater consideration to the local economy, to the communities of people who live there.
Yeah, that's another interesting question. There were, the Temporary Study Commission did produce a report on the economy of the park, but it was the weakest chain in all of their research, and they didn't really come up with any good recommendations. And then the other thing that kind of crippled the APA early on was that the budget was really far below their needs for the first 3 or 4 years. They really had their hands full just implementing the law as it stood. And the APA Act is a fairly complex document. I think it's 130 pages or more. And one of the things the APA is supposed to do is long-term planning and sort of a vision for the park. but really for most of its life, it's been essentially the Board of Zoning Appeals for 6 million acres. And it's been bogged down in just dealing with the crisis du jour. So, so yeah, I think it could have been different had the legislature and the governor supported it better in the first few years of its existence. But, you know, these counterfactuals are you know, tricky territory because, you know, if you know anything about New York State history, the mid-1970s were when New York City came within a whisker of going bankrupt and nearly dragging the state of New York down with it. And so really there was a gigantic fire to be put out downstate, and the state economy was in a tailspin. So the Adirondacks were hurting, but all of rural upstate New York started to be hurt in the 1970s. It was just that inside the blue line, the APA gave the locals a convenient target for their anger.
Mm-hmm.
Hi. This was great, but we are just about at time. So before we wrap up, I just want to give Brad last thoughts, anything that you want to leave us with about this very big topic.
Yeah, you know, it's great to be addressing the Preservation League. There are so many different commonalities between the environmental movement and the preservation movement. It's always really puzzled me and also intrigued me about the possibilities for environmental groups and planning groups and preservation groups to work together on things. And, you know, the Adirondacks is one place where that can actually happen. So that's a great reason to, you know, to study this piece of land. You know, it's the size of the state of Vermont, but it has fewer people than Tompkins County. It has only about 110,000 residents. So it's a small town, really, in a very big territory. And so you might say, why pay attention to this place? Why is it so important? It's important because so many things that are so important to the health of communities and the future of the planet have been tried here. And while it's been a struggle, they're basically working. So I think that's why it's worth reading.
Yes, I agree. I think there are lots of lessons from the Adirondacks that can be applied statewide or across the country. And we're excited to be digging into some of it and very excited to have hosted you, Brad. I think this is a great conversation, and I haven't read the book yet, but I'm very excited to. So
It's very good. It's hard to put down.
Yeah,
Yes.
Well, the second printing should be shipping in the middle of August. So
nice.
we'll
Well, to all of you out there, if you haven't read the book yet, go to Brad's website, awildidea.com, and you can pick up a copy of the book there when it is available, and I encourage you to do so. And thank you, Brad, for being with us. Thank you, Erin, for guiding this conversation, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We have lots more programs coming up always, so follow us on social media, check our website, and we will be back soon, and have a good day.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.